Today's topic is the upcoming Spear of the Magus buff and how it will affect the item, especially in comparison to Obsidian Shard. In patch 4.5, Spear of the Magus will receive a buff. Currently, the item stacks up to 3 times, with each stack providing you with a 10 flat protection reduction against the target hit by the ability you used. With the upcoming patch, this is changed to 5 stacks. As such, the maximum value of protection reduction you can reach with this item is now actually 50 flat protection reduction. That in itself sounds very strong, and we will look into how effective this really is, how effective this is in comparison to Obsidian Shard, and what else this means for your team, plus which characters make use of it. So this video will start with some values that on their own will only give you an idea of how good the item can be or how bad it is. And then with more information that comes later in the video, you will get a better perspective of what else is important about this item, so don't just rely on the numbers. To begin, let's first look at Obsidian Shard. Obsidian Shard is currently the gold standard when it comes to magical penetration items or general items that are used to go through the protections of an enemy. It has 33% magical penetration against the target that is hit by the ability. It gives 60 power, it costs 2,300 gold. Spear of the Magus, on the other hand, is, as of patch 2.4, more of a niche item for gods that already have protection reduction in their kit or have a very high amount of ticks in their kit, and as such is not bought very often. It has 15 flat penetration, it has currently up to 30 flat protection reduction, and will have up to 50. It has 50 power and costs 2,150 gold. So it's 150 gold cheaper than Obsidian Shard, which is nice, but at the same time it has 10 power less. If you were to compare that and just look for the pure value of 10 power, the power would probably end up being more expensive in most cases if you're looking at tier 1 items, whereas with higher tier items it becomes a different story. Generally speaking, I don't think it makes too much of a difference. 10 power is nice, but it's not game-changing in most situations. At the same time, 150 gold is nice to save up on, especially early, but it's also not game-changing. So in that way, both items are kind of even, and what you want to look more for are the protection reduction values. In order to compare this item, we will assume that you build Shoes of the Magi in both cases. This is actually very important, and you may wonder why you should still build Shoes of the Magi when you're building Spear of the Magus. Theoretically, you should get sufficient values of flat penetration or protection reduction rather, so you might not need the item, right? The point why you're still getting it and why you should still get it over Shoes of Focus, at least early on, you can maybe swap it out later, is because of the initial damage. Even the gods that have tick damage will have abilities that hit hard on the first tick, and as such, you want to get high damage off with that as well. Flat penetration really helps with that, because what you will do is you will deal damage, higher damage with your initial attack, but then even more if you have ticking dots or something like that. Also, you have to keep in mind that what Spear of the Magus has is protection reduction, so you will not overcap by building Shoes of the Magi. As Spear of the Magus itself only has 15 flat penetration, you actually have 35 flat penetration to go until you reach the cap. As such, you can even build Pen Boots and Spear of Desolation and you would still not quite hit the cap. Now we have established the base values. Before we get further into the numbers, a quick reminder, if you enjoyed this content, please click that sub button. I might throw this in from time to time now, it really helps me out. Alright, into the numbers. As you can see in this not all too pretty table, I have assigned certain conditions to certain protection values. There are magical protections, and you will have these protection values, or your enemies rather will have these protection values under certain conditions. The first value is 30 magical protection. This is what most gods start with on level 1, and it's also what many gods keep if they don't have any magical protection scaling. For example, mages don't have that. The next value of 50 magical protection is what level 20 characters have if they have magical protection scaling. So for example, assassins or guardians or warriors. They usually swing around that number somewhere. Obviously, the numbers are not quite the same for everyone. They're sometimes off by 1 or 2 or a little more, but this is where you will generally find them. At the same time, this is the value a character with no magical defense scaling will reach if he has a support with Hardwood Amulet around. As such, this is some extra defense that you will sometimes see. It also works with a Gauntlet of Thieves. The next value is 70 magical protection. 70 magical protection is the value that those characters that have magical defense scaling will reach if you have either Hardwood Amulet or Gauntlet of Thieves. The next value is 90 magic protection. This can either be reached by buying Spirit Rope on one of those characters, or for example having Hardwood and Spirit Rope as auras together. Then 100 is just a value that I kept in between there because, you know, I'm just gonna keep the 100, 150 value and so on and so on. And the other value that I wanted to check on was 110, which is if you buy Mantle of Discord, which got cheaper in this patch on a character that has magical protection scaling. Obviously, you could go higher from there, and if we're talking about 150, so somebody who has Mantle of Discord, plus Gauntlet of Thieves, plus Hardwood Amulet, then that would be a condition for that. And beyond that, you'll have to have more magical defense items. So 150 is usually the highest you will see on anyone who's not a tank, and even on those, it's rather rare, especially because Hardwood Amulet is not that popular. 200 magical protection, 250, 300, 325, the cap. All those values are more for tanks and just here to show how it works out if the protection gets even higher. What I've done next is calculated the penetration value from Obsidian Shard in flat penetration. So basically what the percentage value would mean depending on how much defense the enemy has. So this starts very low, obviously. You'll see that the first value is just 9.9 protections because the value that it works off is just 30 flat protection. And then it goes up to 107.25 when you have 325 magical protections, which will pretty much never happen. And then I've calculated how many protections the enemy would have left if you have Obsidian Shard and Shoes of the Magi. Early on, the flat penetration from Shoes of the Magi and the value that's taken away by Obsidian Shard is almost even, but the more protection the enemy gets, the more impact Obsidian Shard has on the total value, whereas at the end 10 flat penetration don't really matter much anymore. But what about Spear of the Magus? And that's exactly what we're looking at in these tables down below. What I've done is I've compared the values that we get from using Spear of the Magus with the values that we had before from Obsidian Shard. What you will see is that obviously the more protection the enemy has, the less effective Spear of the Magus becomes. This is the very bare essence of this, which is very obvious because you only have flat reduction values and not percentage values. What I've done next is I've color-coded the whole thing a little bit. Green means that the protection reduction value of Spear of the Magus is higher than that of Obsidian Shard. Blue means they're pretty much even in, like, shifting slightly in either direction. And gray means that the value of Spear of the Magus is even below 0, so it reduces the protection value below 0, and if you get any auras, you will even lose protection off of that. What you generally want to be looking for are the values where the color is either green or blue. Both means that it's generally beneficial for Spear of the Magus. And we'll see something interesting here. Obviously, if the enemy has very low protections, Spear of the Magus is already better on early levels. It makes sense because it is a flat reduction value and a flat penetration value. So you have 25 flat penetration to begin with, and then you get the flat reduction very early, which does a lot for you. So if the enemy only has 30 protections, so no auras, and is on his own, then Spear of the Magus is just straight up better, and it was always that way. First interesting point here is probably the value around 70 protections, where you will see that it only takes one ability, anything that procs a single stack of Spear of the Magus, to be even in damage with Obsidian Shard. And this is important because many gods have some sort of ability that they used before, some sort of tick damage that they can use early on in a fight to make that happen. So this always was the case, but it will get into the importance of the new changes later. And what you can see here is that you will have this early effectiveness with this particular value. What I also find really important here, and that's where we come into the new part, is that if you actually make it to 5 stacks, you can take the protection of an enemy that has 70 magical protections down to 0. And down to 0 means it's true damage from all your abilities. And it's not necessarily that hard on many characters, and the impact of dealing true damage with all abilities is insane. The reason why I talk so specifically about 70 is because this is a value you will see quite often. Either from assassins that didn't buy any protection items, for example, and just rely on auras, or from mages that are affected by multiple auras. So this is a very common value, and as such you will see that even if somebody is affected by an aura, as long as they don't have any magical protection item themselves, this will be enough. And even going on to 90, 100 and 110, you will notice something. We're no longer able to hit 0 protections on the enemy here, but all of these forms basically just need 2 abilities being used to be as effective as Obsidian Shard. Now this is something not every mage can do. Certain mages just have their burst done after 2 abilities, and for them it doesn't make sense. Think for example Morrigan. So it's not necessarily good for anyone to build it when you look at these numbers. But it generally means that as long as you have anything to tick or anything to use beforehand or any ability that has multiple damage ticks that somehow work, then this is still very, very good for you. And you will still be able to lower the protection values to a very reasonable point. After that, Spear of the Magus gradually starts losing its effectiveness. On 150 protection, it is still effective as long as you get it to 4 or 5 stacks, but that means you have to have dealt quite a lot of damage on a lower amount of damage than it could have been with Obsidian Shard. And it's kind of okay-ish here, but it's not the most effective choice in all situations anymore. Then on 200 magical protections, you can only go even after getting all the stacks, so it's okay-ish, but definitely worse than Obsidian Shard here. And after that, Obsidian Shard will always be better. Now, what you have to keep in mind is that you will not face many enemies that have that many magical protection. This is usually reserved for Guardians and for Warriors in the solo lane. No one else can really invest into that much magical protection unless you have a team full of magical damage. And if you do that, then you might still want to get Spear of the Magus on one of the characters at least in order to amplify everyone's damage. So what you also have to remember here is that if a target has that much magical protection, they are most likely very tanky in general, and they will usually take longer to die anyways, which means that you will most likely use many abilities on them anyways, and usually will get many tinks over time. So while you still obviously lose a lot of damage, it doesn't have to be that bad. And if a character has that much magic protection, I would probably build both the Spear of the Magus and Obsidian Shard, just because I know that while these values kind of counteract each other, at that point they would still reach combined effectiveness. At that point, even though protection reduction is not very helpful for magical penetration because it gets calculated beforehand, you would still get a huge chunk of protections of the enemy that way. For comparison's sake, I've also dropped the table for Spear of Desolation here. If you had Pen Boot, Spear of Desolation, and then one of the 2 other protection, reduction, or pen items, you will see that the shape of the table actually ends up being quite the same. Obviously, you will lower the protections of the enemy more here. You will basically deal true damage to even a target that has 100 protections if you get full stacks, but in its essence, it otherwise remains the same thing. I would highly recommend for it because it once again pushes your early ability damage before the ticks go through, and as long as the enemy has sufficient magic protections for that to happen, it becomes very effective. But then again, just throwing this out there as a little addition to what it looks like when you use that item in there as well, because it's just another flat value. With that, let's talk about the gods that can make use of it, that should make use of it, and that should not make use of it. I do know that obviously this is always a bit of an opinion piece, and as such I will give you the gods that I think make very good use of it, that make okay use of it, and maybe use both in combination as well in certain situations, and those who don't really make that good use of it. The ones that make really good use of it are Anubis, because he gets flat reduction in his kit already. It's just going to be ridiculously strong. We don't need to talk about that. He has take damage everywhere. Aphrodite, she can get full stacks of it just in her 3. Ao Kuang, if you want to go for a dragon build where you max the 2, which is going to be really interesting. We'll see if that actually comes back, but I think it will, and then it will be much stronger in that regard, at least, than Obsidian Shard. Freya, no need to say that here. She was always good with it. It's just going to be better now. Isis, she has percentage reduction in her kit already with a 3, and she also uses her 3 before other abilities. She can get multiple ticks with a wind gust, so no reason not to build it. Kukulkan, he has his ticks in his tornado. Zeus, while he does have high damage either way, a lot of his kit revolves around like multiple ticks on certain abilities, multiple uses of them, and I'm very much convinced that Spear of the Magus will do better for him in most situations. And Shang-Kui, obviously, with the dot on his 1, and the demons in a team fight that just shred the protections from everyone, which is ridiculously strong. Then the gods that can do both or either, really, or are debatable depending on how you want to play them. Agni really depends on if you're just there to blast him with the ultimate or if you want to make use of the dots that he has. Chang'e, just because she has such low cooldowns that while she doesn't really have many abilities, she can just pretty much spam them. Same kind of goes for Apuash, but he also has the ticks in a 3. Hades, that depends on if you want to, well, focus on the ultimate and helping your team by reducing protections for them, or rather your own ability burst. So usually I'd probably get neither on him, honestly. Habois, usually a burster with Obsidian Shard if you want to go for those big ultimates, but also very low cooldown, so he can do a lot with Spear. I think he's one of those where I would very likely build both quite often just to get almost true damage on his abilities in any scenario. Nox, because she has very high starting damage, for example, if you just throw in her ultimate, but at the same time she also has a lot of tick damage after that. She has a lot of tick damage in her one, so really up to you. Poseidon, he does have those big krakens that do a lot more damage if you have Obsidian Shard, but he has the Whirlpool, and if you use the Whirlpool in combination with the kraken, it can work quite well. Ragin, because he has multiple ticks on his ultimate, multiple ticks on his one, but who plays Ragin anyways? And that brings us to the ones that play better or make better use of Obsidian Shard. Kronos doesn't really use many abilities, and also it's great for his tower push, which is ridiculously strong, so Kronos wants Obsidian Shard. Hel, she does not do much with like ticking damage over time. She has her ability burst that she, like a combo that she throws out, and that's pretty much it. And for that, Obsidian Shard is just better. Janus, because you want to hit his combo and then get out, so you're not gonna look for consistent damage, and it makes it a lot better if you hit someone with the ultimate without being in range. Nua, because you're always gonna get those ults off and they're gonna hit everyone and you can't guarantee the shred being on them beforehand. Ra, because his abilities are, aside of his 3, not tick damage, and I wouldn't rely on the 3 for damage, but rather on the 1 and the ultimate. Scylla, because all of her abilities just have like 1 instance of damage, and that's how she's played, and she needs the highest burst in an ability possible. Sol, because she can do pretty good structure push with it. She can also make actual use of Demonic. She's in a bit of a weird place, so I don't really think that Spear is the best for her, though it maybe can work if you play it right. Morrigan, because she only has 2 abilities that she does damage with, really. Thoth, because he is very much reliant on bursting someone with his ultimate, while he can get the stacks with the 1 if he wants to. I would rather have Obsidian Shard on most of the time. And last but not least, Vulcan. Vulcan, because he does a lot of damage with his ultimate without getting any ticks beforehand, and his 1-3 combo is what he usually uses, so it's just a lot more reliable that way. So that is a list of all the gods and where I would place them. But that's not all. There's an important thing that I want to remind you before closing off this topic, and that is that Obsidian Shard gives you more structure damage, which is important for some mages, but not for most. You're usually not a structure pusher, but if that's your goal in the game, then Obsidian Shard works much better, because from Spear of the Magus you only get the flat penetration, as protection reduction doesn't apply to structures. But B, what I find a lot more important, is that allies also benefit from Spear of the Magus. And what that means is that if you get those 5 stacks on a target with 70 magical protection, not only you, but also your Guardian will deal true damage, or your second mage if you have 2 of them, or your second Guardian if you have 2 Guardians. So, depending on that, it will be a ridiculous amount of extra damage for multiple of your team members, or at least one other, because you will almost always have at least 2 magicals. And that, I think, makes Spear of the Magus really stand out, because it's very cheap, and it's such a good team item at the same time. If your support finds some early rotations into middle lane, then Spear of the Magus can set him up for very good kill potential along with you if you have a god that has enough dot damage to make it work. So, in conclusion, I think Spear of the Magus is ridiculously strong now. It has a lot of potential. There's a lot more reason to buy it over Obsidian Shard on many mages, and I feel like that the mages who can make good use of this item will be in a much better place than beforehand. In my opinion, a bit too good of a place if we look at these values, but that's something everyone can judge for themselves. With that, thank you guys for watching. Again, if you enjoyed this video, I would very much appreciate if you click that subscribe button and maybe the bell if you haven't yet. Otherwise, maybe leave a like, leave a comment, and I will see you for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.